Hello, History 1 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 17, Section 3, A Clash of Values. So, as we begin here, let's make sure that we're writing things down. So, in number 1, in the early 1920s, an economic recession, an influx of immigrants, and cultural tensions created an atmosphere of disillusionment and intolerance. And one of the things that kind of brought a lot of this to the forefront was the case of Sacco and Vanzetti, who you see kind of pictured here below. Sacco and Vanzetti were two Italian immigrants from a region around Braintree, Massachusetts, or a suburb of Boston, if you want to call it that. These men had been, for the most part, accused of stealing the payroll of a company and kind of killing somebody in the process. And what ends up happening is these two men are accused, they're tried, they're found guilty, even though they both had alibis for where they were at the time of the robbery and the murders. These two men obviously became scapegoats. And eventually it kind of turned people against the wave of immigrants. We kind of saw them as being radicals and such. And so these two men were executed by the electric chair. And you can kind of see in the picture to the right, they also obviously died, and their deaths were definitely newsworthy to a lot of folks. And so we're going to start changing some of our laws, and we're going to tighten down on immigration here in the 1920s, making it very difficult for Italian immigrants and immigrants from Eastern Europe to come into the United States. And number 3, the Ku Klux Klan came back to life, and it claimed that it was fighting for Americanism and had nearly 4 million members by 1924. The movie Birth of a Nation kind of brought the Klan back to the forefront. And with the racial riots of 1919, certainly there were a lot of people interested in joining the Klan. The Klan of the early 20th century was a little different than the Klan of the late 1860s, in that the Klan of the early 20th century was actually not necessarily centered around the South. It actually kind of had a resurgence again in the American Midwest, particularly the state of Indiana. And it kind of grew from there with this fear of immigrants and racial strife that was happening right after World War I. So needless to say, we're changing. And one of the things that did change was the laws. And I mentioned before, we were tightening down on immigration here to the United States. So according to the Emergency Quota Act, which was kind of on the books starting in the early 1920s, only 3% of the total number of people that had of any immigrant group or ethnic group already living in the United States would be admitted in a single year. And part of that was to cut down on a wave of new immigrants that were coming into the United States. And as you can kind of see here on the graph that's below, 1921, we had around 800,000 immigrants coming into the United States. By 1922, that dips to around 300,000, meaning that we cut about 500,000 people out. It kind of rebounds a little bit, but again, by 1925, you can see a remarkable dip. And part of that is because of this next item in number 5, the National Origins Act of 1924 that really went into play in 1925. This new act that was passed by Congress deliberately used data from the 1890 census to favor immigrant groups from the northwestern part of Europe, primarily Scandinavia, Ireland, perhaps maybe even Germany. The idea was we wanted to cut back on those immigrants that were coming from these radical parts of Europe, like Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. And you can see again that we take another major dip on our quota map, as you can see here. These immigrant or immigration policies are going to be on the books for many, many years to come. And what's interesting is by the time we get into the heart of the 1930s and the Great Depression, we actually have more people leaving the United States than coming in, which is kind of the only time that that's ever happened here in American history. And number 6, employers desperately needed labor for agriculture and mining as well as railroad work. And so rather than taking immigrants from Europe, we started looking at immigrants from Mexico to start filling in the need for this. Many groups also wanted to restrict immigration because they feared a new morality that glorified youth and personal freedoms. And we started seeing kind of the values changing. If you would look at like the 1890s, the Victorian era into 1900, women for the most part were very conservatively dressed, high collars, hemlines were very long. By the time we get into the 1930s, things changed dramatically. Many women of the 1920s wanted to break free from traditional roles and what would be expected behavior. And so we started seeing a group of women who were kind of the trendsetters known as flappers. These were women who cut their hair kind of short. They wore very fashionable clothing. They had higher hemlines, so the hems of their dress would come to their knees. They had revealing necklines. So for the most part, this was kind of scandalous. Certainly a major change from what we had seen maybe just 20 years before or a generation before. And number 10, many Americans also embraced a new morality while others feared the loss of traditional values. And as a result of that, we're going to see people kind of turning back to conservative religion. Evangelist Amy Semple McPherson, who you see pictured below, conducted revivals and faith healing ceremonies. She was very flamboyant and very theatrical in her evangelization. What's interesting is she disappears for a time in the 1920s. She actually had a popular radio show, was a very familiar name to most Americans of that period of time. But there were some people that thought that she was kind of getting involved in some corrupt activities and that maybe she was in it more for the money than she was for the faith. And she ended up kind of disappearing. And some people thought perhaps maybe it was an emotional breakdown. In number 12, the Scopes trial, which you kind of see pictured here to the right, involved a man named John Scopes, who was a science teacher from the state of Tennessee. And it involved him teaching evolution in schools in the state of Tennessee. Tennessee had a law on the books that said that if you were teaching biology, you had to teach the creation side of biology, much like what you would hear about in the book of Genesis. And Scopes, what he did is he taught about evolution in the terms of maybe talking about Charles Darwin. And he was found guilty of doing this, and he was put on trial, and his trial became probably one of the most publicized events of the 1920s. The state of Tennessee used William Jennings Bryan as their attorney to prosecute the case. And what's interesting is Bryan lost this case, and literally within days of losing this case, he actually died of a heart attack. So needless to say, it was kind of an interesting thing. Scopes was found guilty of teaching, evolution, but in a sense, it kind of changes the way that some Americans want to see education, and eventually you're going to start seeing evolution taught in schools. The 18th Amendment specifically granted states and the federal government the right to enforce prohibition, hence making the sale and transportation of alcohol illegal. When this went into effect, you had many groups that tried to get rid of the alcohol that they had on hand. As you see a fellow there pouring bottles of alcohol into the gutter. But it also started up a whole industry of bootlegging. So, as Treasury departments struggled to enforce prohibition, organized crime was thriving on the illegal trade of alcohol. And probably one of the most notorious of organized crime bosses was Al Capone, sometimes nicknamed Scarface. Um, Bootlegging became very common. As you can see here, this woman that has basically couple of containers there on her legs, covered by her long coat. Many people were running it just so they can make money. Prohibition did come to an end in 1933 with the ratification of the 21st Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. This amendment nullifies the 18th Amendment. It's the only time that you'll see that in the Constitution. But it also allows the federal government and state governments the opportunity to regulate and tax alcohol, which they didn't have before. Thank you very much.